When Jalen corrected his teacher, he got expelled. But what the school didn't expect was who was coming to pick him up. The school bell had just rung at Lincoln West Middle School in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Students poured into the classrooms, chatting about last night's football game or what was on the lunch menu. But for Jalen Bryant, the day was already mapped out in his head. Jalen wasn't like most kids in his 7th grade class. While others spent their weekends glued to video games, he was up at sunrise helping his father, Terrence Bryant, run their farm. Their land stretched for acres, fields of soybeans, corn, and even a few cattle. It was hard work, but Jalen loved it. He knew things most kids his age didn't. How to rotate crops, maintain irrigation lines, even how to tell when a storm was coming just by the way the wind shifted. He was proud of his family's legacy. Farming wasn't just their job, it was in their blood. But today, none of that mattered. As he slid into his seat in Mr. Bradley Whitmore's 7th grade science class, he already knew what was coming. They had a unit on American agriculture, and Mr. Whitmore, a tall, stocky man in his mid-40s, was handing out worksheets. "All right, class," he began, adjusting his glasses. "Today we're talking about farming techniques. You'll find everything you need in your textbooks. Follow along as we go over traditional and modern farming methods." Jalen skimmed the worksheet. Right away, he spotted things that didn't sit right with him. The section on soil rotation? Outdated. The paragraph on irrigation? Missing key facts. The claim that small farms were being phased out by corporate agriculture? Not entirely true. His family was living proof of that. Mr. Whitmore continued, walking up and down the aisles as he spoke. Farming has changed drastically over the years. Traditional methods are becoming obsolete. Most small farms are struggling to survive, and corporate agriculture is taking over. Jalen raised his hand. "That's not exactly true." Mr. Whitmore turned, his expression tightening. "Excuse me?" "My family runs a farm," Jalen said, sitting up straighter. "We use modern techniques, but we're still a small business, and crop rotation isn't outdated. It's actually more important now because of soil depletion." A few students turned to look at him. Some smirked. Others whispered. Mr. Whitmore let out a short laugh. "Jalen, I appreciate your input, but I think I'll trust the experts who wrote the textbook." "But the textbook is wrong." Sorry, Jalen insisted. "We use precision farming, drones, soil sensors, GPS-guided tractors. Small farms aren't just surviving, they're innovating." The room got quiet. Mr. Whitmore set his textbook down and folded his arms. "Jalen, this class follows the curriculum. If you have concerns, you can discuss them after class." Jalen clenched his jaw. "But you're teaching us the wrong information." A few kids chuckled under their breath. Mr. Whitmore's face darkened. "That's enough. Take your worksheet and complete the assignment." Jalen didn't back down. "So we're supposed to just copy wrong answers?" The tension in the room thickened. Mr. Whitmore's voice dropped, cold and sharp. "You're being disruptive. If you can't respect this class, you can leave." Jalen stared at him, heart pounding. "I'm just telling the truth." That was it. "Office, now," Mr. Whitmore snapped, pointing at the door. A few gasps rippled through the classroom. Jalen's hands curled into fists as he grabbed his backpack and stood. The stares burned into his back as he walked out, his chest tight with frustration. But he had no idea this was only the beginning. Jalen walked down the hall, his sneakers squeaking against the polished tile floor. The air was thick with a mix of anger and disbelief. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't loud or disrespectful. He just refused to let someone tell him that his reality, the very thing his family built with their hands, wasn't real. When he reached the office, the secretary barely glanced up. Mrs. Dunbar, a middle-aged woman with tight curls and a sharp gaze, tapped her keyboard. "Mr. Whitmore already called," she said, pointing at a chair near the principal's door. "Have a seat." Jalen slumped into the chair, his knee bouncing. A few minutes later, the door creaked open, and Principal Harold Easton, a gray-haired man with deep lines on his face, gestured for him to step inside. The office smelled like old books and lemon-scented cleaner. The principal leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Jalen?" he started, his voice tired. "What's going on?" Jalen sat up. "I corrected Mr. Whitmore on something in class. He said I was being disruptive." Principal Easton sighed. "Did you raise your voice?" "No." "Did you argue after he told you to stop?" "I just told him the textbook was wrong," Jalen said firmly. "Because it is. My family farms, and we..." Easton held up a hand. Look, I'm not saying you're wrong, but in a classroom setting, you have to respect the teacher's authority. Jalen's jaw tightened. Even if he's wrong? Principal Easton hesitated. There's a time and place for discussions like that, he finally said. Maybe you could have asked him after class. Jalen shook his head. He wasn't going to listen. He laughed at me. Easton sighed again, heavier this time. Jalen, I have no reason to believe Mr. Whitmore was trying to disrespect you, but he felt you were disrupting the class. That's the issue here. Jalen's fingers dug into his jeans. So I'm supposed to just sit there and let him teach things that aren't true? Before the principal could respond, the door opened and Mr. Whitmore stepped inside. His expression was tight, his arms crossed over his chest. I see we're still debating this, he muttered. Principal Easton looked between them. Mr. Whitmore, I'd like to find a way to resolve this without taking disciplinary action. Jalen says he wasn't being disrespectful, just correcting misinformation. Mr. Whitmore's face darkened. This isn't about whether he's right or wrong. It's about following rules. I gave him an instruction, and he ignored it. Jalen swallowed his anger. You didn't answer my question. You just wanted me to shut up. Whitmore's lip twitched. Watch your tone, young man. Principal Easton leaned forward, rubbing his chin. Mr. Whitmore, is this worth suspension? Jalen's heart pounded. Suspension? For what? Whitmore hesitated, then said, I think a firm consequence is needed. Easton let out a long breath before nodding. Jalen, I'm going to have to send you home for the rest of the day. We'll discuss further action tomorrow. Jalen's stomach dropped. That's not fair. Principal Easton raised a hand. It's not about fair, Jalen. It's about structure. Jalen stood, his chair scraping against the floor, his fists clenched at his sides, but he knew arguing wouldn't change anything. Mrs. Dunbar called his mother, and within 20 minutes, Tasha Bryant arrived, her face unreadable as she walked into the office. Jalen knew that look. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. Disappointment. Easton explained the situation, and by the time they walked out, his mother's silence weighed heavier than words. The car ride home was tense. You want to explain to me why I had to leave work for this? She asked finally. Jalen stared out the window. I told the truth. Tasha let out a slow breath. You could have told the truth after class. Jalen shook his head. He wasn't going to listen. His mother didn't argue. But when they pulled into the driveway of their farmhouse, Jalen's father was already standing outside, arms crossed. Terrence was a big man, broad shoulders, rough hands from years of work. He didn't raise his voice often, but when he did, people listened. What happened? He asked, his voice steady. Tasha explained as Jalen stood there, kicking at the dirt. When she finished, Terrence exhaled through his nose. They suspended him for that? Tasha nodded, and Easton said they'd discuss further action tomorrow. Terrence's jaw tightened. So, we're punishing kids for knowing more than their teachers now? Jalen's chest loosened a little. At least his dad was on his side. I'll handle it, Terrence muttered. But before he could walk inside, a deep voice rumbled from the porch. No, the voice said, I will. They all turned. Ezekiel Bryant, Jalen's grandfather, stood in the doorway. His 6'4" frame cast a long shadow, his silver beard trimmed sharp. Dressed in dark jeans and a pressed button-up, he looked like the kind of man who didn't waste words. Jalen's stomach flipped. His grandfather didn't get involved in small things. If he was stepping in, this wasn't small anymore. Ezekiel cracked his knuckles, his gaze hard. They want to send my grandson home like he's some delinquent, he said. Fine. Then his lips curled into a smirk. But tomorrow we're sending a message. And by the next morning, nobody at Lincoln West Middle School would forget the name Ezekiel Bryant. That night, Jalen barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he replayed the moment in the principal's office. The way Mr. Whitmore looked at him, like he was just some kid who didn't know anything. Like his voice didn't matter. But the moment that stuck with him the most? His grandfather's reaction. Ezekiel Bryant wasn't a man who got worked up easily. He had been through too much, seen too much. A retired military veteran, he built his wealth through smart investments in land and agriculture, turning a small farm into an empire. People in town respected him, some even feared him. Not because he was violent, but because he was the kind of man who never let disrespect slide. So when he said they were sending a message, Jalen knew something big was coming. By morning, the house was buzzing. Jalen sat at the kitchen table, staring at his uneaten toast as his mother paced, phone in hand. "I don't understand how this escalated," she muttered. "Why are they acting like he committed a crime?" Terrence sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable. "Because some people don't like being challenged." Ezekiel sat at the head of the table, calm as ever, cutting into his eggs like he didn't have a single worry. Then, without looking up, he said, "Jalen, put on a clean shirt. You're coming with me." Jalen blinked. "Where?" His grandfather finally looked up, a slow smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "To school." Before Jalen could ask why, he heard it, a deep, distant rumble, the kind that made the windows tremble. His father set down his mug. "Now, Zeke." Ezekiel pushed back his chair and stood. "I told you, I'm handling it." Jalen ran to the front door, throwing it open just in time to see it, a sleek black helicopter cutting through the sky. His breath caught as the aircraft descended, kicking up dust as it hovered over the family's field. The blades whipped through the air, sending leaves flying, making the horses in the distance stir. Jalen turned to his grandfather, eyes wide. "We're taking that?" Ezekiel stepped onto the porch, adjusting his cufflinks. "I told you, boy, we're sending a message." His mother shook her head, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Daddy, is this really necessary?" Ezekiel turned to her, his voice steady. "You want your son to learn to keep his mouth shut when he knows he's right?" She hesitated. Ezekiel nodded. "Didn't think so." With that, he walked toward the helicopter like it was just another morning, the pilot already waiting with the door open. Jalen didn't hesitate. He followed his grandfather, climbing inside. The moment he buckled in, the engine roared, and the ground disappeared beneath them. His stomach flipped, but he barely noticed. Because today, they weren't just showing up to school, they were making an entrance. And everyone was about to pay attention. At Lincoln West Middle School, Principal Easton was already having a bad morning. He had barely sat down with his coffee when his secretary rushed in, her face pale. Sir," she stammered. "What is it, Mrs. Dunbar?" She hesitated before blurting out, "There's a helicopter landing on the football field." Easton blinked. "Excuse me?" But before she could repeat herself, a deep, rhythmic vibration filled the air. Books on his shelf trembled. The windows rattled. Easton shot up from his chair and rushed to the window. What he saw made his breath hitch. Right in the middle of the football field, a black helicopter was touching down, kicking up dirt and grass. And stepping out, moving like he owned the place, was Ezekiel Bryant. The helicopter's blades slowed, but the impact was already made. Students flooded the hallways, pressing against the windows, mouths hanging open. Some pulled out their phones, recording as the 6'4" figure of Ezekiel Bryant stepped onto the field, his polished boots crunching against the grass. Behind him, Jalen followed, gripping his backpack, trying to process what was happening. From inside the building, teachers peeked through their blinds, whispering. Some students gasped, others laughed in disbelief. One kid muttered, "Yo, is that your grandpa?" Jalen barely nodded. Security guards rushed toward the field, but Ezekiel didn't even slow his stride. Principal Easton stormed outside, his face red, his tie slightly loosened, looking like a man already regretting his morning. "Mr. Bryant, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded over the dying roar of the helicopter. Ezekiel adjusted his sleeves, speaking with the same unshaken calm he always had. "The meaning," he echoed. "The meaning is, my grandson was kicked out of this school for knowing more than the man teaching him, and that doesn't sit right with me." Principal Easton ran a hand down his face, clearly thrown off. "Look, I understand you're upset." "Upset?" Ezekiel chuckled. "Son, I don't get upset. I get answers." Jalen watched, stunned, as his grandfather walked straight past Easton toward the main entrance of the school, like he belonged there. The security guards looked at the principal for instruction, but Easton hesitated. There was something about Ezekiel that made people second-guess themselves. Power, authority, a man who didn't have to raise his voice to be heard. "Mr. Bryant," Easton called after him, jogging to catch up. "You can't just walk in here unannounced." Ezekiel stopped just before the doors and turned, his gaze sharp. "Unannounced?" he said. "Your school had no problem throwing my grandson out without a fair discussion. So consider this my way of announcing that I'd like one." Jalen bit the inside of his cheek. His grandfather didn't yell. He didn't need to. Every word landed heavier because of it. Easton exhaled through his nose. Fine, we can talk. But this spectacle? He gestured toward the helicopter. It's unnecessary. Ezekiel smiled. See, that's where we disagree. By now, the entire school was watching. From the second-floor windows to the cafeteria doors, students and staff peeked out, whispering, texting, recording. And just like that, the principal had no choice but to let them inside, because Ezekiel Bryant wasn't asking anymore. Inside, the main office felt tighter than usual. Jalen sat next to his grandfather in front of Principal Easton's desk. Across from them, Mr. Whitmore stood near the filing cabinets, arms crossed. Ezekiel leaned back in his chair, tapping the armrest with a single finger. I want to hear it from him, he said, nodding toward Whitmore. Tell me why you kicked my grandson out of class. Whitmore shifted, straightening his posture. Mr. Bryant, this isn't personal. Jalen was disrupting the class. I asked him to follow instructions, and he refused. Ezekiel tilted his head. So let me get this straight. A child corrects false information in your lesson, and instead of encouraging discussion, you punish him? Whitmore's jaw tightened. It wasn't the time or place. Ezekiel leaned forward slightly. Then when is? Because I was under the impression that school was where kids learn. The room fell silent. Jalen swallowed. He had never seen a teacher struggle for words before. Whitmore finally cleared his throat. Regardless, Jalen's behavior was inappropriate. Ezekiel stared at him for a long moment, then let out a low chuckle. Inappropriate? He tapped the desk. Boy, I was in the military. I know what inappropriate looks like. A kid correcting a teacher? That ain't it. Principal Easton cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Mr. Bryant, we can discuss this rationally. Oh, I am rational, Ezekiel interrupted. That's why I came here first instead of taking this to the school board, the local news, or... He glanced at Jalen. Social media. Easton flinched. Because he knew the moment this went public, it wouldn't just be about Jalen anymore. And Ezekiel Bryant wasn't bluffing. This wasn't just a visit. This was a warning. The room felt like it had shrunk. Ezekiel sat back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, completely at ease. Jalen, on the other hand, sat stiffly, his hands curled into fists in his lap. Across from them, Mr. Whitmore looked like he had swallowed something bitter. Principal Easton adjusted his tie, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Jalen could see it in their eyes. They had expected an angry parent, maybe even a yelling match. But what they got was worse. A man who knew exactly what he was doing. Ezekiel clasped his hands together. Let's be real, gentlemen. This ain't about classroom disruptions. This is about control. You didn't like that my grandson challenged you. So instead of handling it like an educator, you handled it like a man protecting his pride. Whitmore's nostrils flared. That's not... Ezekiel held up a hand. Careful now. The weight in his voice shut Whitmore up instantly. Then Ezekiel turned to Easton. And you? You let it slide because it was easier. You didn't stop to ask yourself whether it was right. Principal Easton straightened. Mr. Bryant, I understand your concerns. No, you don't, Ezekiel interrupted, his voice still calm but sharper now. If you understood, you'd be apologizing right now. Instead, you're trying to save face. Easton opened his mouth, then shut it. Jalen watched, stunned. His grandfather wasn't just talking. He was dismantling them, piece by piece. Whitmore cleared his throat. With all due respect, I have a curriculum to follow. If every student stopped the lesson to challenge the material... Ezekiel raised a brow. Did every student challenge the material? Whitmore hesitated. No, but... Did more than one? Whitmore clenched his jaw. No. So just my grandson, then? Whitmore swallowed. Yes. Ezekiel spread his hands. Then sounds like this isn't a classroom problem. It's a you problem. Jalen had never seen an adult speechless before. Whitmore's face burned. I didn't mean any harm. Ezekiel leaned forward, locking eyes with him. Maybe not, but harm was done regardless. Silence. Principal Easton tapped his pen against his desk. Mr. Bryant, I want to resolve this. What exactly are you asking for? Ezekiel exhaled through his nose. First, Jalen goes back to class. Today, with no mark on his record. Easton nodded slowly. We can arrange that. Ezekiel raised a second finger. Second, he gets a formal apology from you and Mr. Whitmore. Jalen's breath hitched. An apology? From a teacher? Whitmore's face twisted. That's unnecessary. Ezekiel shrugged. Then I'll have to get in touch with the school board. I have friends there, you know. Might even make a few calls to some local reporters. You ever seen what happens when a school tries to silence a black student who is just telling the truth? Easton stiffened. Whitmore's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Jalen swore he could hear the gears turning in their heads. Ezekiel was giving them a choice, but not really. Either they did the right thing now, quietly, or they did it later, under public pressure. Whitmore looked at Easton, then at Ezekiel. Then, reluctantly, he sighed. Fine. Ezekiel turned to Easton expectantly. The principal adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Jalen, we shouldn't have rushed to judgment. I apologize. Jalen sat frozen. He didn't know if he was in shock or just waiting for someone to tell him he was dreaming. Then, slowly, Whitmore exhaled, his hands clenched, like it was physically painful for him to do what he was about to do. Jalen, he said through gritted teeth, I'm sorry. Jalen didn't say anything, not because he couldn't, but because for the first time he didn't have to. Ezekiel clapped his hands together. Good. Now that we've settled that... He stood, towering over the desk. I'll be keeping an eye on this school. If anything like this happens again, I won't be coming alone. Easton's brows pulled together. Is that a threat? Ezekiel grinned. Nah, it's a promise. Jalen grabbed his backpack as his grandfather turned to him. Come on, boy. Let's get you back to class. And just like that, the meeting was over. As Jalen walked down the hallway, every pair of eyes was on him. Students whispered, some nodded in approval, others just stared. Jalen wasn't sure if they saw him differently now, if they looked at him with respect or just shock. But honestly, he didn't care, because when he stepped into the classroom, Whitmore barely looked at him. And for the first time ever, Jalen took his seat knowing he had won. Jalen slid into his seat feeling a weight lift off his chest. The classroom was silent. Some students eyed him cautiously. Others grinned like they had just watched the greatest showdown in history. A few kids gave him a nod of respect. Not the kind you get for being cool, but the kind that says, I saw what you did. That took guts. Mr. Whitmore stood at the front, gripping his textbook a little tighter than usual. He didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge Jalen's return. But Jalen didn't need him to, because everyone in that room knew what had just happened. The lesson carried on, but something was different. Jalen wasn't just another student anymore. He was proof. Proof that sometimes standing your ground meant shaking the whole damn system. Later that afternoon, the helicopter lifted off once again. Jalen stood outside with his grandfather, watching as the blades cut through the sky. The school parking lot was still half full, but he knew that by tomorrow, the whole town would be talking. Ezekiel adjusted his sleeves, glancing at his grandson. So, what'd you learn today? Jalen thought about it, about how he had been ready to fight with words, how he had thought the only way to be heard was to argue louder. But his grandfather had shown him something different. Power wasn't just about being right. It was about knowing when to make people listen. Jalen smirked, that when people underestimate you, it's their mistake, not yours. Ezekiel chuckled, smart boy. They stood in silence for a moment, the sun dipping lower in the sky. Then Ezekiel clapped him on the shoulder. Next time, though, just tell me before you get yourself kicked out of school. Jalen laughed. No promises. And as the helicopter disappeared into the clouds, Jalen realized something. This wasn't just about him. It was about every kid who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. Every kid who knew something the world didn't want to hear. And today, for all of them, he made sure they did. Never let anyone silence the truth, especially when you know it better than they do. Knowledge isn't just power, it's a weapon. And the smartest people, they know exactly when to use it. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were right but weren't taken seriously? Drop your story in the comments. Let's talk about it.